I'm going to be talking about something with probably the worst name ever, OPDS. We actually weren't sure exactly what it meant, so we changed a few times. But it doesn't really matter. OPDS is about something very simple. This is the long version that you can read, but I'm not going to be reading this at all. The short version is it's about reading anything anywhere. It's about distribution. Most of you probably use services like, let's name them, the Kindle, the Nook, iBooks. All these systems really focus on something which is making the user experience pretty simple and very easy to get content, but in a way where you're completely trapped. You're trapped because you're using a reading system, so this reading system can be an app, it could be a device, it could even be in your browser, but you're not allowed to get content from anywhere you want and to read this content anywhere you'd like. The idea of OPDS, and the reason why we started working on OPDS several years ago now, was to make sure that we can create a future where anyone could publish content that you can use and read anywhere. And this not only concerns booksellers, but also libraries, publishers, authors, anyone. You don't need to be in the trade publishing industry to distribute your content. So 2 years ago, we were actually in San Francisco for, did we have a name for the conference? I'm not sure. The pre-books and browser conference. Yeah? Nerds and Browser, yeah. That's probably the right one, yeah. And at this time, we realized something that was quite new, and that thing was that people were okay with the idea of reading e-books on smartphones. A lot of users, a lot of companies never expected this kind of thing to happen. And when we realized this, we started thinking about how we could distribute content. And this first happened with my own company. Between my own companies, actually Feedbooks, and a reading system called Stanza. And this turned into a proprietary format to create what we call catalogs. And after some time, we quickly realized that this was more important than just distributing content from one service to one reading system, and that we had to create something that anyone could use. And so 2 years ago, we were talking about what we could do to make this happen, how this could turn into a standard. A little over a year ago, we finally had the first version release, thanks to Keys, mostly. And we had the design to do the basic stuff in a catalog. And the basic stuff in a catalog is, how do I search for a publication? How do I browse through a complex catalog? And how do I acquire content? I'm using the word acquire, not download or buy content, because we want to encompass all the different acquisition methods that you can have. Content, some of it may be, in some catalogs it might be about lending, and in some other catalog you might be starting a subscription. We really want to support all these different ways of acquiring content. And this summer we went a little further and started adding things. So how do we support more complex acquisitions? I'll define this afterwards. And how do we provide the kind of browsing that people expect, not only on smartphones these days, but on larger screen devices, tablets, on potentially any device. And hopefully, in December, we'll also tackle a few other important issues, such as lending and subscriptions. So, what's the state of the ecosystem? And I really insist on the word ecosystem for OPDS. I don't even know the full list of applications supporting OPDS. It used to be pretty easy to track them down. It's not anymore. I don't have a clue. And it's a pretty good thing that I don't have a clue, because they don't need to know me, they don't need to send me an email to work in this ecosystem. We've released the tools, we've released documentation, they have examples, and pretty much anyone can integrate now OPDS as a feature, as a way of getting content into their application. And it really has become a must-have feature for indie apps. And this is, I think on Android alone, we have at least 15 different OPDS clients, at least. Once again, I don't know all of them. The other interesting thing is that a year ago, OPDS was mostly used in catalogs to distribute free content, public domain content, self-published titles. And in a year, this changed quite a lot. Now we have companies like Blue Fire, for example, working with retailers all around the world and providing content from major international publishers. And it's really growing internationally. At Feedbooks, we have content from major publishers in France, the US, Germany. I know many Asian countries have local retailers interested in also selling books this way. And it's really amazing the kind of international growth that we've seen for the ecosystem. Even though most people are still very focused on the American market for ebooks, we see that this kind of solution, this kind of standard of ecosystem has a huge growth in many, many different places. For the user base, I don't even have a clue either. I know we have at least 10 million users, since some of the most popular reading apps have up to 3, 4, 5 million users. And the interesting part is that many of these users are actually not just accessing catalogs that other people created. They're just not connecting to a bookstore or a library or a publisher. They're actually producing their own catalog themselves. They take all the files that they have on their computer and they put it into something like Calibri or Calibri to OPDS, and then they have their own catalog that they can use on any device. So that's a very interesting trend, and it's also proved my point that you don't need to be involved in the publishing industry to publish a catalog and use them. And third point, but very important one, since the release of the 1.0 spec, we've always had a way of validating an OPDS catalog, but we didn't have an easy way to do this on a website where you could just enter a URI and then get insulted by the validation service, which is the purpose of validation services. And we have this now, we have a first version, and this is going to be evolved in the next few months and improving over time, hopefully. I'm going to be showing a few features that we've added for OPDS 1.1. I'm not going to be showing or talking about each of them, but some of the most important ones. The first one is facets for faceted search and browsing. If you take a catalog like the Internet Archive catalog, you have what, 2 million ebooks available, at least more than that. Yeah, you have a lot of books. Yeah, and just browsing this catalog using something like basic things like new releases or I don't know, most popular books. This is not enough. You need to have complex and advanced way of sorting these catalogs, and also making sure that you move from a large set of publication to a smaller subset using different rules. And we've added this in OPDS 1.1 using just a few links. This is an example of an application using facets. An interesting example, actually. They released their OPDS support, I think, a week ago. It only took them like 2 or 3 days to get from no support to not full OPDS support, but almost full OPDS support. And since this is an application designed for Honeycomb, so for a tablet, what they do is that they constantly display facets on one. They constantly display facets on the left while they display content on the right. And this is a very similar design that we see on many e-commerce websites and that even people use with search engines such as Google. But when we really started working on OPDS, we didn't have these devices. We had smartphones, and smartphones have very, very limited screen space. And when we moved to these new devices, we quickly realized that simply displaying titles and asking the user to go back and then select another way of sorting the catalog wouldn't work, that we need to constantly have advanced way of sorting and finding stuff in the catalog. And with OPDS 1.1, we finally have this. And the most important part about how we implemented facets and how we added support for facets is that we're not dictating what facets should be like. So if you're a specialized bookseller, for example, you might have highly specialized categories, or you might have very specific ways of browsing a catalog. For example, I've seen a few bookstores specialized in romance, where you can use facets to select how hot the book is. And they usually have different names for how hot the book is. So sometimes you have little hearts, something it's spice, sometimes it's, I don't know, spicy or whatever they're using. And the goal here is to enable anyone to use facets the way they want to use them. And that makes a lot of sense. It's not just sorting. Here I'm sorry it's in French, but it's the Feedbooks catalog. It's pretty basic. It's just selecting the price and sorting the catalog. But really it's up to the catalog provider to do whatever they want with these facets. Yeah. A second feature, and this is not exactly a feature, but this is something that we realized over time, is that aside from simply providing a way of browsing through a catalog and listing publications, we need to enable catalog providers to also feature content. And the same way that we design how facets work, we created a very generic way of featuring content. Basically, you can specify if you're featuring content, if it's popular content, if it's something that's newly released, or if it's a recommendation. But you can use these however you want. You can decide which heading you'd like to display, which means that the same way that you can have highly specialized facets when browsing through a catalog, any content provider can really decide to feature the kind of content they like and label it the way they want. And since this is completely presentation agnostic, this is one way of displaying featured content, but another application, for example, this time Aldico, on a smartphone would do things differently. In their case, they don't have as much space as you have in a tablet, so they just display featured content on top using an element with 3 covers at a time. But once again, it's up to the content provider to decide what they would like to feature, how they would like to label it, and then OPDS clients, rating system, can be creative about the way they display this content and adapt to the platform where they are to have a relevant way of displaying featured content. A third feature of OPDS 1.1 is support for indirect acquisition. Some catalogs have fairly complex acquisition flows, which means that, for example, you can do pretty much everything in an app, but to buy the book or to rent something, you need to go back to the browser, or you need to download a packaging format, so a zip file, for example, where you will find the different formats. And this is an issue that many people had before we released 1.0, but we really couldn't find a good and generic way of dealing with this. And with 1.1, we've really created a few basic elements to deal with this. And it's generic enough to represent different problems. So we can deal with things like DRM, unfortunately, but we can support DRM this way. And we can nest elements to represent pretty complex flow. And the idea of indirect acquisition is to solve the generic problem having a resource in between the publication that you want to acquire and the publication itself. And hopefully we've sorted that out. Yeah. When we started working on OPDS, we had a very monolithic vision of that thing. We thought that catalogs could pretty much do everything, and they were magical. With catalogs, we could deal with whatever we had to go through. And, well, I don't know if we're wiser or, well, with time, we started realizing that, no, it's not that easy, and that we should actually have a more modular approach to this. And instead of talking about just catalogs anymore, I think more and more we're going to be talking about three different things: a catalog, a shelf, and a callback. So how would I define a catalog, for example? First point, and this is very important, catalogs are discoverable and can be shared. Unlike application where someone else controls the content that you can access, catalogs are pretty much like websites. It means that if you know the URL, or if you have a link, you can easily add them, you can share them, you can discover them on the web, you can discover them on the social networks, you can do whatever you want. We use catalogs for four things: discovering content, browsing through a catalog, searching, and acquiring content. And the goal of catalogs is really to design an experience. And it's up to catalog provider to design this experience. Different catalogs will have different ways of organizing the collections, and we're fine about this, which wasn't always the case. And it's up to the content provider to really decide how they curate or how they feature books or how they organize things. And the goal of catalogs is to do all those things, but in a way that's easy to use and completely integrated in the reading environment of the end user. A second thing, I've talked about this actually last year, so you can find my presentation about this, is the second concept is the shelf. And the notion of the shelf is, a shelf is where I store my content. And I don't have to actively store it. Most of the time, as soon as I acquire the content, it is stored for me on this shelf. Shelves are not, you don't need to have a catalog to have a shelf. A retailer, for example, could only support shelf and let people add these shelves to their reading environment as a very easy way to find and download what they've bought previously. Shelf, once again, can be either public or private. So it can be something that you only use for yourself, or it can be something that you share with other people, for example, in the company. Shelf can, depending on the reading environment, shelf can be synchronized or not. So if you acquire a new book, your reading environment could automatically download it for you or not. It could also be something where a place where you go to get your content again. And another very important thing is that shelf can be aggregated. So you don't need to have multiple shelves. You could have this idea of that you would get content from multiple places, yet have all of this content in a single place. So your global shelf, the place where you aggregate everything. And the third one is probably the new one. The other two, we had them in mind, is the idea of a callback. And a callback is basically a message. It's a message between the content provider and the reading environment. It can contain basic things like how do you acquire the content, metadata. It could also be a way of saying to your reading app where they can find your shelf in the catalog. But the most important part is probably it's a very good way to discover services. And annotation is a very good example of the kind of service we can have in those messages. Two examples of callbacks. Several people have talked about this book today, but truth is, we don't really, well, if you decide to read this, this book in a browser using web apps like IBIS, for example, or Bookish, the current workflow to buy this book and read it would be you would have to download the file locally most of the time and then upload it back. So we don't really read or acquire or get the book in the browser. Most of the time we have to get the book locally and then upload it back. And if the only systems where you can avoid these two steps are systems where you're completely trapped and there's no way you can move your books around. The idea of OPDS callback would be that we wouldn't have to download the file locally and upload the file again. You would have a simple message that goes from the content provider to the reading environment to do all that stuff for you. So not only the reading environment would know how to acquire the book, but it would also get metadata about the book. This message could also provide information such as where do you want to share your annotations. It could have many different things. So not only does this would make the experience easier and enable to have the kind of simple and easy user experience in a decentralized way, but it also enables new things, a lot of new things. And I talked about service discovery, and this is probably the most important one. Let's say, for example, that I'm part of a scientific community, and I really love very technical papers about, for example, software engineering. Well, the message that goes from this content provider to the reading system could also enable to discover services such as annotation sharing in your field. So not only would I be able to read this paper, but I could also it could also add a service when I can share annotations in this specific field, or other kind of services. It's up to us to imagine the kind of enhancement we could have in this message and service discovery. Peer reviewing would be an example, discovering the catalog itself, but we could really enhance books with services and invent new standards, create new useful services, and do this in a completely decentralized way. You don't have to, you're not trapped in a single environment where you cannot decide where you connect your reading environment to share annotations, do whatever you like. A few upcoming features too in OPDS 1.2. One of them, I really call it necessary evil, is the OPDS URI scheme. We can share and discover catalogs in OPDS, but there's no way we can easily add those catalogs without doing copy and paste or manually entering URIs. And we really want to make an experience where it's possible on a web page. So with just a single click on the, for example, add the Feedbooks catalog to your app, with a single click, do things such as add a catalog, add a shelf, and launch a callback. So the reason why we're adding a URI scheme is because it's not the way in mobile environment where we could do these things without having a URI scheme. Another thing that we'd like to really improve in OPDS, and that we're improving with the next revision, is support for lending and subscriptions. You have wonderful resources like the Open Library website, where people can easily borrow books, but currently we lack three things that are really important for subscriptions and lending. There's no way we can know when the publication would be available. So this is useful even for a bookstore for things like pre-orders. This is useful for if you have if you're lending a book, but it's also useful for if you're publishing a magazine or a newspaper to know when the next issue would be available, for example. We don't have the length of the acquisition, so when do you have to return the book if you're lending a book, or the length for the subscription if you're subscribing to any kind of content. And there's also the idea of a subscription shelf that basically works like the other kind of shelf, except that this is the kind of shelf where you'll have content pushed very frequently, and you want to check this shelf more often than the other kind. And aside from these evolution in OPDS 1.2, so that will hopefully release this year, we're thinking about a few other things. One of them is maybe a new serialization. We're not quite sure about this. People familiar with serialization know that JSON is pretty popular these days. It makes things like integration into web apps easier, but we lose a few things that we currently have in OPDS catalogs that works pretty well, such as discovery of services through links and various things that Atom and OPDS do very, very well. So we might be losing some things if we go in that direction, but we might also gain other things. So we'll have to discuss this and probably test things around. Another thing would be domain and media specific metadata. So you've seen, I'm not talking about books when I'm talking about OPDS. I'm aware of at least one catalogs that provide audiobooks, and potentially you could use OPDS catalogs to distribute music, to distribute video content, to distribute anything. And if we're talking about other media, then we might have to provide better metadata for those media too. We're constantly improving the ecosystem. So I've talked about the validation tool, but providing better discovery is important. We're going to be providing more and more documentation. And last but not least, since we're doing a lot of efforts on service discovery, we're going to be able to integrate very well with upcoming standards such as annotations and anything else in specific fields that might be interesting. So I really encourage you to discover what OPDS is all about at the following URL. I don't know if I have any time for question. One question. If it's yep.
Take this please with a grain of salt. Would you ever consider renaming it? I mean, it's a great service. Branding thing, just scrapping OPDS and calling it something else?
I think we do. In the developer community and among power user, people know the name. But it's true that we could probably have something better. I know the archive, for example, well, most of the time we talk about book server, although book server, I never really understood what book server is, but OPDS is part of book server. But it might be a good example of a better name for this kind of technology. And you're right, yeah, we should.
RSS clearly sort of made it into the mainstream without most civilians really quite understanding what RSS stood for. I mean, I'm thinking out loud here. I don't know if it's a deal breaker, but clearly you have a branding challenge, right?
Yeah.
So you're saying it needs an orange logo. An orange logo.
Yeah, we could use a logo with a bright color. Maybe even a wet floor. I don't know if that's trendy anymore. Yeah, the wet floor effect that you have on Web 2.0 services, whatever. But yeah, probably. But the good thing about OPDS is that people don't have to know about it. And most don't. They just click, hopefully they just click on the link, add the catalog, and we talk about things like catalog, shelf, which are words that people understand a little more better than OPDS. And we have millions of users downloading content using OPDS. It have no clue that it's called OPDS, and it works fine. So I guess we're already happy with that part, although we could probably improve a few other points. Thank you.